Veronica Post is a furniture maker, teacher, and an award-winning graphic novelist based in Nova Scotia. She's written 2 graphic novels so far, both published by Conundrum Press. The books are part of a planned trilogy focused on the trials and tribulations of their title character Langosh and his trusty dog Peppi. The first 2 titles, Fugitive Days and Hot to Trot, are journalistic explorations of Veronica's experiences that think through the realities of war, history, migration, and trauma. In this conversation, we talk about Langosh, Peppi and Yeva, Hot to Trot, an adventurous, ponderous romp that takes the reader across the United States on a tour not only of different spaces and cities, but also of the characters' emotional lives. The book is a thoughtful study of how relationships evolve, often through friction. I thought the friction that came out of differences people had about specific social issues was really relatable. People argue about religion, about capitalism, about the crisis of unhoused people that has spread like wildfire since the outbreak of COVID. There are triumphant moments too in the book, where splash pages take us into heroic moments of women leading with care, people connecting over their shared outrage, and linking up in spite of significant differences to be there for each other. It's a great book. It's also beautifully drawn. Veronica has a real eye for landscapes, and because Hot to Trot is taking you on this big adventure, she has an opportunity to capture all kinds of different sunsets, spaces, and methods of movement. People don't stay in one place for very long, and the characters in the book have a pretty restless attitude toward time, especially Langosh. Langosh doesn't want to think about the future, but the future has him in its clutches. He can't avoid it. But this isn't his fatal flaw. Veronica reveals what that is from her perspective in this conversation. If you read the book, though, you'll pick up on it. It's a lot of fun, but it's also really full of sympathy and subtle speculations on how people work or don't work as social beings, and also some of the ways that time takes us through this meandering path towards something like realization and connection. I loved the new book. I really enjoyed installment 2 of the Langosh series. I'm calling it Langosh because book 1 was Langosh and Peppi. Now we've got Langosh, Peppi, and Yeva.
Yeah.
I'm curious to see which protagonists get added to Volume 3, but the world will have to wait and see.
Yeah.
But yeah, congrats on getting it out.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I really appreciate hearing that. I'm glad you liked it.
Mm-hmm. And like the book has this interesting kind of framing, both like if if people pick it up, the back of the book has these wonderful quotes from Noah Van Sciver and James Spooner, but also these kind of like interesting questions that get raised about the book. So there's like a degree of framing there. But then there's also like you yourself kind of present the book to the reader at the beginning. And in that opening, you offer this kind of disclaimer about how the events in the book are based in fact, but shouldn't be taken maybe as factual. You say that, the subject of the book for you is, quote, painful, nonlinear, unavoidable, and necessary transformation.
Mm-hmm.
When we first talked about the first book in the trilogy, Fugitive Days, you said that the stories in it shouldn't be seen as journalism or as history. And I feel like that's what you're getting at with your use of maybe nonlinear here. But that phrase, nonlinear, is evocative, especially in the, within graphic storytelling where the line is such an important thing. So yeah, I mean, this is where I kind of wanted to start. Like the timeline is a line, whereas what you're doing is nonlinear. What did you want to emphasize that this, nonlinear narrative was doing through the use of that phrase specifically?
Well, I think yeah, it's interesting to hear your question because I think your framing of the question makes me think about that use of that phrase a little differently. Um, I think what I was initially getting at with the saying it's nonlinear is that I picked events, and memories, but I didn't necessarily order them in a linear fashion. So,
Sure.
so there's things like with that there when I was thinking of it being non-linear. Um,
Hmm.
But also, yeah, I think in terms of this sort of where I go into the beginning of both the books, kind of being like, this isn't exactly like journalism, or it's not exactly like super historical. I think I'm just really aware that, this is just my subjective take on these experiences. And,
Hmm.
other people who were present at the time of those experiences might have a different take or a different perspective on what happened. So I think there's that there too.
Yeah, yeah. There's a degree of kind of responsibility implied by needing to get it right in the context of journalism, an ethics to it. In the context
Mhm.
of graphic storytelling, I often think about like Cole Paul's talking about the way that he feels a different level of responsibility when he is representing like his friends. Just
Yeah.
even getting their likeness right is implies a degree of responsibility.
Yeah, that's so true. I
Yeah.
feel ultimately, I think I was like, okay, my biggest responsibility here is to be true to myself and my own experiences, and that's not easy for me because I am a people pleaser, so I'm always constantly like, well, they might feel differently about it, and I think that's helpful in the sense that it adds different layers to it, and like I'm
Right.
able to see things from different perspectives, and that adds a lot to anything. But I
Hmm.
think that, yeah, it's definitely just my subjective experience I'm trying to highlight, and that was very challenging for me, but I it was important. And then I felt like maybe that was what was going on when I was talking about that about the nonlinear and about all of the things at
Hmm.
the beginning of the book, was just kind of me more reflecting on that, I think.
For sure. What you just said was interesting from the perspective of like Margaret Galvin has this book that I just interviewed her about called Invisible Archives, where she talks about the history of underground comics and
Mm.
how like a lot of it is just kind of totally flagrantly unethical and even sort of misogynist. And
Yeah.
your books are obviously much more, I would say, sensitive, empathetic, and like on the True North count. I think it's True North County Comics
Oh,
podcast.
yeah.
You talked about how this installment, Hot to Trot, is really about these two people, Langosh and Yeva, caring for each other, but also like having moments of friction and these
Mhm.
differences. Um, I loved Yeva in the first book. Like she just she's a scene stealer. But Langosh is on his own a lot
Yeah.
in Fugitive Days, which is why like Langosh is so attached to Peppi and why Peppi is such an important character in a way in that first book.
Mhm.
Otherwise, our eponymous character would be completely alone.
Mhm.
Ask about how different it was to depict tension between people so frequently in this book. Like narratively, the sort of tension we see Langosh and Yeva deal with is something you might see in like a romantic plot, like a
Mhm.
rom com or even like marriage story in one of these more serious dramas. Langosh and Yeva's relationship is like really interesting to me. It's platonic, but it's also so intense.
Mhm.
It's interesting to see such an intense relationship between a cis man and a cis woman, like on the page, and have it not be romantic.
Mhm.
Were you trying to kind of figure out how to show the reader what connects these two people? Did you have to make a decision about how to explain it to readers, or did you kind of want to let their relationship be a little uncertain?
I guess I didn't really think too much about whether or not I needed to clarify what kind of relationship it was, like if it was
Hmm.
romantic, if it was ever romantic, or like what was really going on there. I think what connects Langosh and Yeva is the fact that when they met, they were both in unfamiliar territories. So Yeva is like a Russian expat who was living in Budapest. Uh, Langosh, was sort of this fugitive from justice from Canada who was living there, and they're both weird and weirdos and who didn't fit in, and they met each other, and they think that they really connected on that basis. of just kind of being like, hey, we're sort of both different and weird and kind of like up for anything, and we see things from these different ways from what the people around us might see things. So they connected on that level, and I think in this book we're really seeing how that relationship changes when it moves into a different context.
Right.
And Yeva, being like so used to being confident and in control and like really, really like the leader of her own destiny. When
Mm-hmm.
she was in Budapest, all of a sudden she's like in this context that she's not familiar with. She's doing things she doesn't know like exactly how they work, and she's just trusting Langosh, but that definitely puts her in a position that she's not very comfortable with.
Mm-hmm.
And she's trying to be comfortable with it, but it's also kind of like, well, like, wait a second. I don't really like, I'm just kind of, doing this thing. Maybe this is good. Like, maybe it's good to have these new experiences, but I'm not sure. And maybe we don't agree. But I didn't
Mm-hmm.
really feel like I needed to clarify if their relationship was romantic or not, or had ever been romantic. I think, you know, um, that wasn't important.
Yeah, no, and I think it's like something that we too often project onto stories,
Yeah.
like it's such a generic feature of stories, and personally, like it's not a thing I appreciate, like it adds this unnecessary level of predictability that like
Yeah. Yeah.
why do that,
I
you know?
know. I was kind of like, even if I was interested in making
Mhm.
it a romance, that would really affect some of the other things that I wanted to say. And I was like, this
Mhm.
isn't really about that. It's not about whether or not they're romantic towards each other. It's about the different ways that they move through the world and see things. And it's about kind of how flexible we can be within our relationships with other people, I think.
Yeah. And like, the a lot of the story takes place like on trains, hopping trains, and like
Hmm.
to use a train metaphor, I think the romantic piece would derail the story. And it's funny too cuz like I remember when you gave interviews about Fugitive Days, you did talk about how like when you were traveling for years, you I think you said you would put it in terms of like you were following love or something like that, right? So it
Hmm.
was like wrapped up in that for you, but
Yeah.
I think you're exploring themes and kind of the human condition more generally here, and like part of the human condition is difference. Maybe the core part of it is
Yeah.
difference. The fact that
Hmm.
people are different from one another, and so like Yeva and Langosh argue a lot in the book. They argue about a lot of things, and that's kind of where I wanted to take things now. Is like what is the contents, multiple kind of different kinds of content of their arguments. For me, like maybe my favorite was the debate they have around like the question of the church, of religion in people's social lives.
Hmm.
Yeva is religious. Langosh is decidedly not religious. Um, and so, like, the reader has to kind of position themselves in relationship to that. First of all,
Yeah.
they have to go in. These two characters, having totally different perspectives, have to go into a church when they're hitchhiking.
Hmm.
And I found it really fun to see Langosh kind of sweating it out when when he has to like answer the question of whether he's like accepted Jesus or whatever.
Yeah.
Um, you know, he has to look for a tactful way to like maintain his integrity sort of, but like not stick out in this space. And
Yeah.
he just says he has
Yeah.
accepted Jesus, I think.
Yeah.
And I kind of wondered what you were doing in that scene, like whether that was based on your own experience, within maybe those spaces of like the church and Christian, the
Yeah.
ongoing place of Christianity in the lives of like us as white Westerners. Like it's an interesting thing. Um, say white Westerners as though we come from the exact same background, which is not true. Um, do you sympathize with specifically Yeva's idea about trying to kind of meet people where they're at and respect their attachment to religion? clearly she sees value in faith,
Mhm.
and sees it as like having a lot of different roles maybe in people's lives.
Yeah.
Yeah, like where does your sympathy lie in terms of that?
Oh, well, like with every argument in this book, like me arguing with myself, like
Sure.
I see both perspectives, but I'm more sympathetic to Yeva's perspective.
Mm,
And that isn't to say that I disagree with the foundation of Langosh's qualms with the church, with
mm-hmm,
evangelical, sort of very North American style Christianity, especially. Um,
mm-hmm,
so I definitely, I see where he's coming from, and generally speaking, he's just an anti-authoritarian in every respect of his life,
mm-hmm.
until he's just blind to seeing how he can be an authoritarian himself. So with this, I definitely see and maybe sympathize a bit more with Yeva's perspective, because we can have, however, like all of these really legitimate criticisms of the church, but I think Yeva's coming from a place of understanding what it means to like forcibly remove religion from people's lives, and
Mm-hmm,
um I think that that's just as problematic. you know
mm-hmm.
so I think, yeah, I think I'm sympathizing with her because I think she can see a different perspective. And the other part to that whole scene is Yeva's unfamiliar with this form of Christianity. Like, this is her
Mm-hmm.
first experience with that particular brand, and so she doesn't have preconceived ideas about how this relates to politics or anything else.
Yeah.
So she is experiencing it in this very, um I guess, what word should I use, like sort of unbiased kind of way.
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
I think Yeva, or I think Langosh is, he's coming to it with all kinds of preconceived ideas about like what it means to be an evangelical Christian, what that says about your politics, what that says about all sorts of, what your personal beliefs might be on various things.
Mm-hmm.
So she's experiencing this from a very different place than he is, and if we took the context somewhere else, like if they were in a different culture and they were invited into a different place of worship, Langosh might not have that exact same reaction that he had. He
Right.
might be more curious and more respectful and more open, but
Yeah.
we can be so harsh to the people that we think we understand. um
Mm,
and I think sometimes we just need to take, not that I'm like I'm proselytizing here about people should join the church. I'm just saying we feel safe making generalized assumptions about individuals based on their beliefs, and it might not be quite so simple as that.
yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's totally what you're exploring in the book, and like the thing I would link it to is this scene where they enter a bar, and this guy sort of immediately flags them as like people who would vote for Obama, and Yeva's like, who doesn't like Obama? Like she just doesn't. It's that sort of that newness or that naivete that gives her the ability to kind of undercut some of the like partisanism or
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
polarization within especially the US South, I guess.
Oh yeah, she's not going to
Um
get into the same argument
right.
that everybody else would get into immediately.
Yeah. And it leads to that incredible like photo
Yeah.
that I think really works. I got a big laugh out of that one. Um but yeah, I think like just in general what I loved about the evolution of Yeva in this book is like she has this class consciousness that Langosh doesn't exactly have in his dogmatic attachment to being anti-authoritarian,
Mhm.
and that class consciousness or that self-awareness about privilege that Langosh, for all of his righteous rage against the ruling
Mm-hmm.
class, doesn't have, does give her this opportunity to kind of emerge as like a major part of this trilogy. There's a
Mm-hmm.
conversation toward the end of the book that I don't want to spoil, where Langosh's perspective toward other people's ambitions, especially, like he just sees that as the worst,
Yeah.
becomes like a real focal point. What I really liked about that scene was how Claire, I guess Langosh's sister,
Mm-hmm.
insists that Yeva let herself disagree with Langosh. Like, just
Yeah.
let yourself be at odds with this person, even if you love them. It is okay, right?
Yeah.
And I feel like there's a lot going on in that exchange. Um, because yeah, like Langosh is the hero in some ways. He's like, it feels like the title character, the through line,
Yeah.
but here you're giving details that make him like not heroic,
Yeah.
like flawed. He,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
if you've already kind of pointed to it, but like, did you want to talk about that scene specifically, the function of Claire, in a way here to kind of expose some of the contradictions in Langosh? And is it like that lack of self-awareness that you see as his fatal flaw, or is it something else?
I think his fatal flaw is that he's a zealot who is like refuses to acknowledge the validity of different perspectives.
Sure.
I think that's his fatal flaw, and it's because he's formed very, very strong values, not based on compassion or community or love, but based on fear and self protection and um, anger.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's his flaw, and but he's a very complex character. So there's a lot other things going on there,
Right.
and he's very capable of being sensitive, and um, he cries very easily, and
It's true.
he's he has he's so sensitive actually that I feel like it's almost getting in the way of him being brave enough to challenge himself or his own
Mm-hmm.
thoughts and feelings. Like, but like you had some questions. You have some questions coming up about time that I think I can get more into that. But with that conversation between Yeva and Claire, I think that was kind of an important point where you have a few other times in the book where Yeva's meeting people who are close to Langosh who are friends of his.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then in this relationship, you're seeing it's a sibling relationship, it's a family relationship, it's not just friends. And so Claire is able to see Langosh with from a place of like loving him in a way that's like, this isn't like, I don't have a choice whether or not to care about you. Like, you're my family member and I've been through this with you now for years and it's affecting me, and it's not just about you.
Yeah, exactly.
I think that conversation was so important for Yeva because she was like, oh, okay. Like,
Mm-hmm.
there are other people in his life who care about him on a level that isn't just about like validating him. It's about like also asking him to be accountable to the other
Mm-hmm.
people in his life.
And to like grow up in some ways, like to just grow in a different direction.
Yeah.
It's like you want to sympathize with Langosh, and you do because
Hmm.
in many ways those flaws come from like trauma
Hmm.
at the hands of a carceral state.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which if we have time, we'll come back to. But you
Yeah.
mentioned this, yeah, the question of time, and one of the things that I really liked about the book is the like reflections on the kind of different paces and rhythms and temporalities of life. There's a lot, especially about the conflict between Yeva's concern about the future, about projects, what she's doing, where she's going, and Langosh's kind of what I would call presentism
Mm.
that you're exploring. And the book does feel more or less agnostic about what the right attitude toward time passing and futurity is.
Mm-hmm.
You said that the book is kind of you arguing with yourself, so I would guess that you have those same tensions, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
that that like you know creating a graphic novel takes a long time. I know one of your influences is Seth, and he talks about just like the amount of time it takes to draw and how that's kind of on some level a deterrent to
Yeah,
doing new books.
it is.
You know that you're just like you're in it, right?
Yeah.
Were you kind of like, I wonder, I kept thinking about like work, right? The time of work and how Langosh is trying to like avoid that form
Mm-hmm.
of like being held captive to time and deadlines,
Yeah.
and like, you know, what he desires, which is this kind of post-work future, you know, a pretty anti-capitalist mode of being. Where did you land in terms of like thinking about our ability to value time, enjoy time, use our time, or I guess like kill our time, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Um, well, I am definitely I struggle with maintaining an awareness of the moment that I'm in. So
Right.
I do have a bit of a, meditation practice where I'm trying to be be a little bit more grounded because I can get very carried away in my anxieties about the future or like the past or whatever.
Hmm.
And so there's this sort of paradoxical thing where these books that I'm creating, they wouldn't have happened if I actually hadn't been living in the moment and not necessarily doing what I wanted to be doing at in that moment. Like I spent all
Hmm.
these years traveling, and a lot of those years that I was traveling, I was like, well, I wouldn't necessarily be choosing this, but now that I'm here, I'm having this great experience. So maybe I should just be
Hmm.
present to that experience and just enjoy what's happening right now and just get the most out of it, And that was
Hmm.
really valuable for me. And then, um, I sort of got the opportunity to settle myself a little bit and build on these dreams that I was having while I was, living in the moment and traveling and being very rootless, where I was like, oh, I can actually create these things that I've been dreaming about creating, like these books and working on advancing my skills as a craftsperson and finding a community of people that, are my friends.
Hmm.
Family. And so that was great. But now I'm here working on these books where I feel like all my inspiration is drawn upon those years where I was like not doing any of that.
Right.
And so I'm
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
am I sacrificing future work to
Hmm.
this lifestyle that I have now, which makes it possible for me to do my current work?
Mm.
I think about that a lot, and I'm just like,
Yeah.
maybe I need to take a break and like go live life again, instead of
Mhm.
just being holed up in my house, like creating these books based on my past.
Yeah, I mean, I know people like Sylvia Federici have written about how like the history of like labor has not always been the way it is now, where like we have one job and we do that one job until we like retire and die or something.
Yeah.
It is, you know, formerly was the case that people were much more nomadic in terms of
Yeah.
the kinds of experiences and jobs that they would take.
Yeah.
Um, and so like there's definitely something enticing about that. But the I do think the kind of the structure of society basically incentivizes us to pursue a career path and to stay on
Mhm.
that path, and punishes you in many ways from deviating from that
It
path.
does.
So
Yeah.
but for art's sake, it does sound like going back to attempting to be a little bit more rootless might be fruitful. I don't know.
I think it would be, but and there's other side to that, which is Yeva's experience, like you were saying, her fresh perspective being in a
Hmm.
place where she doesn't have all these preconceived ideas about people and context.
Yeah.
Um, I experienced that, when I was, traveling, throughout the Balkans and into former Yugoslavia. And
Hmm.
there's so much nuance to everything, and I was just completely like, I don't understand any of this nuance. So I'm just talking to people and like relating to people based on, how they seem. Are they friendly? Are they helpful? And now, well, great. Then like let's be friends.
Mm,
And and then I just like learned so much, and I was like, man, the more you learn, the more complicated it becomes and difficult to relate to other people just as the individual person that they are, with all their
sure.
complexity. And I kind of want to get back to having a bit more of a fresh perspective instead of being stuck in these like rigid ideas about people.
hmm And that comes through in this book. I would say like this book feels much more explicit about like racial politics, for example, than Fugitive Days, which of course also, especially toward the end, engages with the Syrian refugee crisis
Mhm.
and the ways that like borders, militarized borders, militate against people being able to live, basically.
Mhm.
And there does seem to be this like, even though the work you're doing isn't journalism, this like slide into social criticism that I am personally pretty stoked about. Like, I think your fresh take on borders and racism and even like the borders, imagined or otherwise, between people is really interesting because your work is so like empathetic. Um, and I think it's interesting right now that like Joe Sacco's Palestine is being rushed by Drawn and Quarterly into reprinting,
Mm.
given the ongoing genocide in Gaza. Right, like
Mhm.
there is clearly a desire for a form of like visual storytelling that isn't overwhelming in the way that like the images, of course, that are coming out of Gaza are.
Yeah.
Um, and I just wondered, like, are you curious about doing more of that sort of like Sarah Glidden, Joe Sacco style reporting, graphic reporting? And what do you think, I guess, could comics provide that like the current coverage of the crisis, with its like, it's limited in many ways. The
Mm.
coverage of the crisis has been limited,
Yeah.
uh, does not provide.
Well, I think that yeah, I would be interested in doing something like that. I gravitate more towards um doing that in a way that is maybe reflecting how these greater events and movements affect people's relationships with other people they care about. Um,
Right.
and I think I would choose, if I was going to choose any uh, conflict to focus on, it would be the Russia Ukraine conflict.
Yeah, yeah. You've been really vocal about this. Yeah.
Yeah,
And rightfully so.
I feel that there's a lot that gets lost. There's so
Yeah.
many details that are important that are lost when we're just like looking at headlines.
Hmm.
And also, I think that people have a way of like they can be very zealous,
Hmm.
and there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. I I understand it, but I think, and I'm not saying anybody else should be like me. We're all going to be different and have different responses. But I think personally, I'm more interested in. I'm not a zealous person. I'm much more interested in question asking
Hmm.
rather than providing, basically a list of things that people should agree with me on, or else they're gonna be cut out of my life.
Hmm. Hmm.
So I think that yeah, I'm more interested in asking questions and finding connections, and also just being self-reflective, because
Hmm.
there's a lot of double standards, there's a lot of hypocrisy, and I think we're all very fallible in that respect. None of us are 100% morally consistent,
Hmm.
and I think it's important to interrogate ourselves and understand our own um, motivations and feelings, because I think people get confused between their emotions and their morals, because
Interesting.
those things don't necessarily always overlap perfectly. Like, oftentimes I'm finding myself confused because I'm like, my emotions seem to be in conflict with my morals here. Like, why is that in whatever particular situation I'm in? And I think
Mm.
Yeva is a good example of that, because I think she's sort of like, morally speaking, she's like, okay, like, well, what happened to Langosh was wrong. So why am I mad at him for like how he's deciding to react to it? Like, what's that about?
Mm.
Doesn't he have the right to react however he wants to react? What does it have to do with why is it making me upset? You know, I
Yeah.
find myself in these situations a lot in regards to like world events, and I want to maybe work more with that.
I love that. I mean, I think there's so much value in being able to ask the right question at the right time. I think it stays with people more
Mhm.
than like being, lectured at, for example.
Yeah,
You can feel like you're providing all this moral clarity by lecturing people when maybe what they actually need is the right question at the right
yeah,
time.
yeah.
There, on that point, I think, one of the there's a couple things that I guess I wanted to point to, which, like, one is just the importance of dialogue in both books, but like especially this one. I noticed too, like, stylistically, the dialogue in this book feels like it's bigger on the page, like it's like it's taking up more space and it seems more central.
Mm-hmm.
But then there's also like conversations that happen that are about like timely social issues. Like there's stuff toward the end of the book, especially where you're talking about the visible presence of encampments of people experiencing homelessness within the city.
Yeah,
And yeah, just like this is a moment where we are in Chibuktuk, Mi'kma'ki, where like there are people who are dying in tents,
yeah,
trying to stay warm,
yeah,
and it feels as though we're not having the conversation and we're not asking the right questions. And
yeah.
so were you trying to kind of like explore your own relationship to the root causes of this crisis of unhoused people? Basically, like, how is Hot to Trot trying to think through the issue of visibility?
I think in that, in the book, it does, maybe on like different levels, it touches on a lot of those questions. I think I wanted to include that in there a little bit because I think it's really unfair when people use the visible homeless population as a way of, like, almost as like you're making them the champions of whatever social cause you're subscribing to.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
And it's kind of like, well, these are individuals, these are people who have their own political, social views. They're not necessarily there as bastions to your cause, whatever that might be.
Hmm.
Like Langosh is very much, you know, he's almost kind of like, almost, it's almost as if he's kind of like, well, that's the lifestyle choice,
Hmm.
that
Hmm.
he's kind of making.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's like,
Like,
well,
what
these
are the
people,
implications of that?
right? It's
Right.
like these people might
Yeah.
not be anti-capitalist. They're just
Sure.
stuck in this shitty situation because of this situation that we're in socially and politically and everything else.
Yeah.
I think so. I'm very, very wary of anybody who tries to ascribe people who are suffering in that way, to use them as a way of being like, well, this is, clearly means that my social cause, like, it is more important than yours.
Mm. Hmm.
We need to think about how everybody is complicit in this system, least of all the people who are suffering from homelessness.
Hmm.
It's kind of like this thing that you were talking about earlier with, Yeva's sort of long-term thinking, planning, anxiety about the future. And Language is more like living in the moment. What are the differences there? Which one's better than the other?
Hmm.
And I think there's a lot of people who, they stake their future health and happiness on the value of their property.
For sure.
And they're not unreasonable to do that because that's the system that we
Mm-hmm.
live in. And
Sure.
so, but purely by doing that, you are complicit then in the fact that other people don't have that same security that you do. And so what does that mean? What does that say about you? And so
Mm-hmm.
many property owners are upset about the visible homeless population, not because they're sympathizing with those people, but because that's devaluing the property that they own. And it's just like,
Mm-hmm.
okay, we really need to take a step back here and like look at the priorities that we have. Like,
Mm-hmm.
like the lives of people are more important than the values of property. I think that's something that we need to be reminded of constantly. And also the fact that that's a simple thing to say. I don't think most people would argue with that. But the
Mm-hmm.
solutions to these things aren't so simple. It's like basically the dismantling of our entire uh economic
Yeah.
setup, right? So like
In many ways. Yeah.
right. So that's kind of a complex thing that's
Right.
not so simple to do. Like,
Mm-hmm.
and I think my perspective on this is largely like being a person who's been around and lots of like radical anti-capitalist communities and everything, but then also being somebody who has Ukrainian heritage and knowing what that means when you have like quote unquote revolutionaries show up in your village and claim that you're an enemy of the people because you're a farmer who owns land who doesn't want to join the
Mm.
collective farming unit, and then just being killed because of that. It's like we can take these things, like when we claim that things are so simple and so black and white, like you can cause so many more problems if you don't actually like take everybody's concerns for their safety into consideration here.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that there like we've just gotten it's such a mess post COVID. Like we're still in this like weird zone where it's like it's hard to remember what it was like a few years ago when we couldn't even leave the house.
Yeah.
And now we're out
And
and about
for
and
sure.
we're like, "Oh crap, like there's so many systems that are failing, like our health system, our housing, education,
The environment.
the environment." Is like, whoa, whoa,
Yeah.
whoa, whoa, whoa. Okay, like
Yeah.
we forgot that. Is anybody working on how to make long-term living like in these like retirement centers not a
Mm-hmm.
death trap? Is anyone thinking about that
Mm-hmm.
anymore? Because
Nope.
like like I remember
Yeah.
like just thanking my lucky stars that my grandfather passed away before the pandemic hit, because
Wow.
the how horrible it would have been to try to
Mm-hmm.
just exist knowing that he would have been in Northwood at that time.
Yeah.
And so yeah, I think there's all this, we're getting out of it now, we're like stumbling out of this, and it's like we forgot that we need to fix these things.
Mm-hmm.
Like, well, okay, like I don't have the answers. I just feel that getting uh getting confused between our emotions and our morals,
Mm-hmm.
and also forgetting that we need to have very diverse points of view represented. I don't think we need to make enemies out of everybody um, who isn't exactly uh, seeing things the way that we would want them to see things. We can learn from different people's perspectives, is what I'm trying to say. And I think
Mm-hmm.
a lot of people are a little too fast to throw out somebody's perspective if it's just coming from a different life experience than the one that they have.
Mm-hmm.
People aren't trying to necessarily invalidate your life experience if they're saying that they had a different life experience that led them to have a different point of view on something.
For sure, and it might take work, but that work is worthwhile, and it also takes time, and I think, like, that
Yeah.
I love that phrase, "Take a step back," which is something that, like, we do far too seldom, and, like, it takes time to take a step back. I think that's why. Like, we just never have the time
Yeah.
to really think through the implications of, what we're talking about when we talk about like abolishing fossil fuels or changing the housing system or
Hmm.
zoning laws or
Yeah.
so
Let's have
like
more options.
yeah, let's
Okay.
absolutely have more options,
Yeah.
and start listening to each other. Like, and certainly, like one of the major themes in the book is Langosh's specific limitations when it comes to listening to women.
Hmm.
Like, and I know that you are like avowed card carrying feminist, radical feminist. You talked about this in our last interview, right? That you don't get asked the feminism question enough. And maybe that's why in Hot to Trot there is more of this kind of like, triumphant almost depiction of women as competent, as tough, as resilient. Like there's this scene, for example, where um, Ashley and Yeva are leading Langosh on horseback.
Hmm.
And like just this scene where you've got, women who know how to ride a horse and a man who denies the fact that he doesn't really know how to ride a horse. So like women are strong. They suffer and they endure. You're doing all this stuff around just showing the grit and the capacity of women. Did you
Yeah.
actually like do that intentionally? Was the book an attempt to kind of like not correct the narrative, but like to show women as potentially heroic, as resilient as and so on?
Well, there's like so many things. Like, I don't know if I don't get asked about it enough. I mean, I'm happy to talk about it. I think I would be
Right.
annoyed if like I was constantly like being asked
That makes
to
sense.
be like,
Yeah.
okay, so you're a woman, let's talk about that. But I think I was like really happy to have an opportunity in this book to have just a more diversity of characters in general, because in the first one it really was kind of like Langosh traveling solo, and he kind of avoids people a bit. His
Hmm.
natural inclination is like pretty solo. He
Yeah,
doesn't
yeah,
really
yeah.
know how to incorporate other people into his life very gracefully.
Right.
And so, yeah, in this one, I was like, yeah, I can have all sorts of people in here, and of course, there's going to be women in there, and they're going to have their own relationships to each other and to Langosh and everything.
Hmm.
And so, yeah, that was really fun. I think that there's another conversation in there where like Yeva sets up kind of a joke and doesn't realize it, where
Hmm.
she's talking like in the beginning of the book. There's sort of a conversation between her and someone who's a bit of a more of like a sort of urban radical anti-capitalist, and Yeva just doesn't understand
Hmm.
that perspective, because she grew up in a different way, in a different place, and then
Totally.
sort of like gets just really like angry and confused and like like pissed off.
Oh, the farming
Yeah, the
conversation?
farming conversation.
Yeah, I love
and
that.
and then there's like it just kind of ends up being really funny, and it's sort of like, yeah, I think there was a lot there where it's like, okay, there's all of these people, all these characters in the book, all these women in the book. They're all very strong characters, all very different people, and there can be disagreements and there can be different perspectives, but in the end, there is this sort of shared um, desire to be in community.
Hmm.
So I think that was important, and I think that's something there, like with the difference between Yevan and Langosh, where Langosh doesn't really see the benefit of community in the way
Mm.
that Yeva does. And I think that
Right.
is probably a bit of a gendered thing.
Yeah, I mean, like the way that Langosh courts danger, like in
Yeah.
the friend that he has where they both have POS tattooed, like
Mhm.
that kind of resistant masculinity,
Mhm. Yeah.
the island subjectivity, and
Yeah.
yeah, Yeva is of a different mind entirely,
Yeah.
um, because she knows that like her safety in some ways is like safeguarded by having a community, like
Yes.
a community around her. that has some degree of like trust and social cohesion.
Yeah.
And like there is like where the tension between the two characters reaches its breaking point is really around that issue of like safety,
Yeah.
which I thought was really interesting. I want to ask the question about the kind of transition between the titles of the two books. So you've got the first one is Fugitive Days, and now the second one is Hot to Trot, which I love that title. I remember seeing you on social media promoting it like early on, and it's clearly you had the title like very early.
Yeah.
Um, and it is a title that suggests this desire to keep moving, right?
Yeah.
And like, I thought the scene where, the two characters are like fighting about attitudes toward the future, and then like Langosh kind of wins Yeva over by talking about how a moving train is actually the safest place that one can be. You
Mm-hmm.
can't be touched, right? It's moving through space.
Mm-hmm.
um and so like that's interesting to me, but just this concern with like trying to stay fugitive as a means of staying free seems to be a bit of a continuum between the two books.
Yeah.
But what about that switch in title toward like maybe more levity with Hot to Trot? Was it just about kind of foregrounding the fact that this book was going to have scenes of riding horses, or was it, do you see consistency between the two titles?
I thought that I'm trying to remember where I came up with the idea of Fugitive Days as a title.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it had something to do with it was sort of almost a play on words with refugee and refuge and fugitive and
Mm-hmm.
the
Mm-hmm.
connection between those things. And then Hot to Trot, that came from like a few different pieces of inspiration.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that, yeah, I knew that there was going to be horseback riding, that there was going to be a pivotal scene that had to do with this sort of being in the West, being in the prairies, and this very American landscape, and this conflict that kind of would arise between Langosh and Ashley and Yeva.
Mm-hmm.
But also, yeah, it's kind of like Langosh is hot to trot. Like he just is.
That's
Like
right. Yeah.
he just is. So
He
I
wants
was
to
like,
keep going.
he does. He wants to keep going. He's like literally uncomfortable when he's not on the move, and so that seemed
Mm.
like a good title. And I really do try to bring humor into this as much as possible, because and it can make it a little difficult to talk about the themes of my book, because when I try to talk about it, I'm like police brutality, all the stuff. I'm
Right.
like, but it's funny. I try to make it
Totally.
funny.
Yeah.
And I think yeah, Hot to Trot just hit the right note for me.
Yeah, I think it really works. And like the names that you choose to have this kind of significance for me, like Langosh, I realize at a certain point sounds a little bit like languish, and he does like to be lazy,
Yeah, yeah.
Claire has this connection to clarity, and she is like the voice of reason a lot in the book.
Mm.
But it's interesting too, because like when you think about languish, and he likes his rest. He likes to kind of
Yeah.
languish a little. He also is uncomfortable staying still. So it's like
Yeah.
this interesting tension in that character. But
Well,
um,
yeah. I
you
think
know,
there's a whole thing there with the movement too, where it's like movement, being safe in movement,
hmm
as a fugitive. There's that, and then there's being safe in movement in terms maybe for Yeva a little bit more, and just being flexible with your um, thoughts on things, like being not being stuck in one place mentally,
hmm
is also a way of being safe, of staying safe. And I think, yeah, there's probably a lot of other things we can get into with that whole question when it comes to the movement and the safety part. But then also,
hmm
when you stand in one place, this is a struggle for Langosh. When you stand in one place, all of a sudden there are going to be people who have expectations of you.
yeah,
And that can be really scary, you know? Like, am I going to live up to these expectations? What if I don't want to do the expectations? What if I have to set a boundary around these expectations? Like, what do I want? And he just gets totally overwhelmed by that. And he's just like, you know what? I'd rather have no one have any expectations of me at all. And I'll just, like, keep moving.
hmm there is comfort in that, right? Like
Yeah.
that, I get that.
Yes.
You can reach a point emotionally. You've talked a lot about this kind of confusion of emotion and morals or values. As you get more intimate with a friend or a comrade, like it is the case that you're going to feel more like burdened in some ways by it, like more, because responsibility can feel like a burden, right? But
Yeah.
that's kind of the only way we can guarantee one another's safety and thriving and flourishing in the world, is to have that degree of mutual responsibility.
Well, yeah, and I think about that a lot with people generally, and people taking a look at these worldwide, just like horrific conflicts that are happening,
Right.
and being like, well, the solution is simple, and it's like, just be kind to each other, and it's like, yeah, like, how kind are you to the people in your life that you actually care about and understand and know? Like, it's actually quite a challenging thing. So it's not so, it's doing a disservice, first of all, to people who work in regions that have experienced a lot of conflict, who are working towards peace. It's a disservice to them to say that the solution is so simple, because if it was, like, what are they doing all this work for?
Right.
And it's also just a disservice in general to people in their day-to-day lives who are like struggling to resolve conflicts with the people that they love. And that's what this book is about.
For sure. I really enjoyed it. It is more fun than maybe we represented it as. Like, it is just an adventure story, right?
Yeah.
But I think like the thing that is really terrific about it is that it also is like subtly philosophical in all of these different ways. Like, it's good stuff.
Thank you.
Thanks for talking to me about it.
Yeah, well, thank you for asking all those questions, and I'm really glad that you enjoyed the book.